Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. I feel like I literally just finished my set review video for Jumpstart Historic Horizons, and here I am again with another set review video, this time for Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Maybe we'll get a little bit of breathing room after this one, but for now we're here to talk about all of the new cards from the first Innistrad set that we'll be testing in our Unrestricted Cube. As always, I'll be giving a brief explanation of all of the cuts that we made to make room for the new cards, and if you see any oversights or cards we missed from the set, feel free to chime in the comments below. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to this channel for more content like this, and come join our Discord to talk and draft with us directly. Thanks for your support and hope to see some new faces soon. Alright, the night is young, the monsters are out, let the midnight hunt begin. Let's get things rolling here with the first of the adversary cycle. R&D did a great job of packing a lot of the power of this set into this cycle of early game creatures that scale with the game, and spoilers, we're going to see all of them today. The white one starts as a 3/1 lifelinker for 2 mana, which is a fine rate for an aggro creature, and on 4 mana or 6 mana becomes a slightly larger creature that buffs the rest of your team. Now the sweet spot here is 4 mana, which is where you start to get the desired Anthem effect from the card, but the fact that you can play this as a 2-drop, or if you're sitting on a pile of mana, a 6-drop or an 8-drop, and it rewards you for investing more into it, well, let's just say you should get ready to hear that a few more times this video. If you hear the solemn toll of a bell in the distance, that's because we've lost yet another Dominaria card with Banalish Marshal. Since the start of the cube, Banalish Marshal has fulfilled the role of early game creature with an Anthem attached well enough. Unfortunately for the Marshal, Intrepid Adversary is leaps and bounds more flexible, from the spot it occupies on your curve to the sheer number of decks you can put it in. Marshal was always intended for mono white, but Intrepid Adversary takes the spot and opens it up to other decks as well. I don't believe there's a slot in the cube more contested at this point than the white 3-drop creatures. Not even a year ago we were filling in that spot with clunkers like Ministrant of Obligation and Militia Bugler, and now this spot is so packed full of top tier white creatures that we're shaving solid creatures to make room for even better ones. That's what's happening here with Adeline, Splendid Cathar coming in over Guardian of Faith. Now, you're going to see this a lot this update, with us removing cards that haven't really been in the cube very long, but that's the price you pay when sets get released as often as they do on Arena. Guardian of Faith is respectable, it has merit on offense and defense, and sometimes serves as wrath insurance for your go-wide aggro decks. Even so, it's a double-pipped white card, and knowing that we want to play Adeline, it makes sense to cut a double white card for a double white card. Adeline seems busted to us, with the real selling point being that she herself does not have to attack for her ability to trigger. Curving any 1 or 2 drop into Adeline on turn 3 nets you an extra 1/1 attacker right away. Adeline can sit back on defense with her dumpster truck 4 toughness booty, or get into the action herself, often attacking as a 3/4 or 4/4, sometimes even bigger. She's close to Bramaz, which would be a slam dunk for this cube, and sometimes she'll be even better than that. We recently aired an episode of our podcast, The Deep Dive, where Chris and I talked about some cards that don't quite live up to their reputation, and one category of cards I called out was the Banisher Priest style of creatures that exile a threat until they leave the battlefield. It's pretty ironic given that Brutal Cathar is just that. In fact, the front side of this card is quite literally Banisher Priest. There's obviously more to the story though, since the Daybound-Nightbound mechanic gives this version the opportunity to exile multiple creatures throughout the game. It'll still have all the downsides associated with temporary exile effects, for example the blowout potential when the opponent removes the creature mid-combat and gets a surprise blocker, but Brutal Cathar seems potent enough to warrant a trial run. Moonrage Brute brawls quite well too, and the extra ward ability is a nice add-on to this type of creature. We debated whether Brutal Cathar would be better or worse on average than Sigrid Godfavored, and we agreed that Sigrid's probably better more often, but still made the swap to test out the newer card. It is a single pip white card coming in over a double pip card, and they occupy close enough territory that it felt like a fine exchange that's easily reversible should we want to swap things back around. It's not every day you get an upgrade to a card you're already quite happy playing, but Fateful Absence is here to give Declaration in Stone a run for its money. Now, we didn't actually cut Declaration, which one would assume would be the natural cut. Instead, we trimmed Day of Judgment, feeling like we could drop one of the white wraths in favor of a cheaper piece of interaction. White had 4 Wraths in total, but not many ways to interact with a fast start from an aggro player, and as we'll see with some other cards later in this update, one of our focal points for this update was to increase the density of cheap interaction across most of the colors. Fateful Absence and Declaration in Stone can exist side by side, even if Fateful Absence will feel better 9 times out of 10. I assume being an instant and having the ability to nab a Planeswalker overshadows Declaration's ability to wipe multiple creatures with the same name, although it should be noted that the Clue token is a pretty real downside for both of these cards. We glossed over Esper Sentinel during our previous update, and honestly we're still not entirely jazzed about the card. Its ability is pretty easy to play around, it drops off significantly in the late game, and its best matchup is against a control deck, which white aggro decks already tend to do just fine against. Still, there's potential when backed up with anthems or equipment. The art is sick, and we had a slot open since we're cutting Giant Killer from the cube. Giant Killer isn't bad necessarily, it's just that the front half is so weak, and if the front half isn't being used as anything other than a Dorgy 1-2 body, then that means it's really only here as a Smite the Monsters variant, and we already have better removal than that. The fact that it doesn't really get used as a tapper really hurts the viability of the card, even if it is a nice toolbox card to have around if we ever bring in Ranger Captain of Eos. The blue adversary has a little less to offer in terms of sheer power compared to the rest of the cycle, but it's still a decent body on curve with some real late game implications. We're already running cards like Rattle Chains and Thieving Skydiver, the latter of which was the cut here, not because those cards are great, but out of necessity to make sure blue-based tempo decks have enough early drops to start getting in damage. Thieving Skydiver has some kicker text that comes up from time to time, but in all honesty it was brought back in recently just to fill the role of a 2-1 flyer. We didn't really have any higher reaching goals than that. Adversary fills the same role, operates at instant speed a la Rattle Chains, and as with the rest of the cycle, scales into the late game. On 4 mana, this can 2 for 1 an opponent trying to use single target removal, and even comes down as a slightly bigger body for your trouble. I imagine that's the use case for this card, but it also has implications in the late game against sweepers and even naturalize effects, since it can phase out artifacts and enchantments as well. Merfolk Looter was another card that I dissed in our recent podcast episode, where I claimed that Lootin attached to a frail body like this doesn't quite cut it in higher power level environments like the Unrestricted Cube. I guess someone heard me because the same night we recorded that episode, Suspicious Stowaway was previewed, and it's so obviously better that I can't help but feel like I spoke it into existence. Now, Looter Ilkor is not a card we've had access to on Arena, but it's traditionally one of the go-to looters in well-established cubes, since it accomplishes what Merfolk Looter does while also chipping in damage. We'd be happy to pick up Looter Ilkor, but Suspicious Stowaway is even better than that. I talked in my previous update video about the card Hard Evidence and how it fills a bit of a void for us in terms of 1-mana blue cantrips. Up until now, we've had Opt as the king of cantrips with Brainstorm in the conversation, and Hard Evidence gave us a third that also serves as early defense against aggro. I don't know what the sweet spot for this type of effect is, but I'm guessing that we want 5 to 6 of these in the long run, and thankfully we can add Consider to that list as well. It's a spell that cantrips, and without explicitly stating it, has Surveil 1, which is nearly always going to be better than Opt. I have no doubt that this becomes the best cantrip in Historic Cube for the time being, and it's an obvious mainstay until we see the likes of Ponder, Preordain, or any of the other traditionally busted cantrips. It's a big gap in mana value, but the swap sees Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, exit in the cube. Neither I nor Chris have been impressed by this card, and it often feels like an overpriced unsummon. Blue could use a good control planeswalker in this slot, but we've been fairly unhappy with nearly all of the ones we've tested. I'm not sure how to feel about the art on this next one, but Memory Deluge feels like a strong card selection tool for the environment. It competes with the best of the 4-mana draw 2s, and while the flashback is pretty expensive, the card selection it provides on turn 4 and again on turn 7 seems awesome. We just brought it in, but we've decided to cut Mole Drifter for the time being. Again, a lot of this update is focused on even in the playing field against aggro decks, and despite Mole Drifter being a great value engine, the timing just isn't great for the floppy fish. Now, not every matchup is going to be blue versus aggro, so it's probably a bit too soon to count Mole Drifter out completely, since it can be quite strong in grindy matchups. But we need to dedicate more slots to cards that fit the blue control plan, and Mole Drifter's just not it. Here's to hoping that once things slow down, we can bring this classic back into the mix. I don't really know how the next one's going to perform, but we're going to give Lier a shot in our cube. I don't fully know the reasoning behind it, but Chris has heard some positive reviews for the card, so we figured the worst we could do was try it out and cut it if it ends up being too clunky, which at first glance at 3-4 for 5 with no evasion or immediate impact on the game is indeed clunky. However, I don't have to spell out the upside of this card. It's one of those quote-unquote if you untap creatures, and there's room for a few of those, so in a deck with a bunch of cheap interaction, Lier can lead to some explosive turns. It's a bit of a stretch in my opinion, but no harm in trying. Time Warp was the cut here, which might seem a little odd to some people, but let me lay out our reasoning behind this one. Blue has been performing pretty poorly, and Time Warp is a card that scales with the power level of the decks it's in. Since it doesn't inherently do anything on its own, it's really only good when you're doing something that's already good, and when your average blue deck is falling behind here in gameplay, Time Warp falls behind as well. Now, it's also a very safe card to put in a deck, in that drawing a Time Warp never really does any harm, but for now we're looking to improve Blue's performance, which Time Warp doesn't really do. I absolutely loathe the art on Reject, but the environment seems to be in a place where Reject can pull its weight. It's a conditional mana leak that only hits creatures and planeswalkers, but that's a pretty wide majority of things you want to be countering, and it should serve as another early counterspell for blue control decks to keep pace with aggro decks. Commit to Memory was on the chopping block already, and this felt like a clean swap. Not only do we get to shave some mana off of a counterspell, but we get to break up the Narset Memory combo, which I've never been a fan of incidentally losing to. Again, there will probably be a time and place for commit, but now is not that time. As with Reject, we're bringing in Essence Scatter for much the same reason. Reject might actually be the better of the two counterspells, given its ability to hit planeswalkers, but Essence Scatter is the more evocative of the two and scales into the late game a bit better. It's not really a contest since we're bringing both in simultaneously, but I'm sure most people just like Essence Scatter more. With these two additions, blue control decks should have an easier time picking up early interaction outside of just bounce spells, which in turn should give them more breathing room against aggro decks and the ramp decks alike. Here, we removed Pact of Negation, which was one of the newest additions in our previous update. It's one of those quote-unquote, well, on second thought kind of cards, where we had a reason for including it, and then immediately after shipping the update, realized that it's not serving the color the way we need it to. Our initial take was that it would help to slam a finisher type card and ensure that it sticks around, but if our overarching goal is to improve Blue's game against aggro, then including a counter that essentially can't be cast until turn 5 doesn't sound as appealing. Thankfully, that's the glory of Cube. You can tweak it at the drop of a hat, which yes, is a phrase that I just googled to make sure I was using it correctly. Baral's Expertise is another card that didn't immediately jump out to us, but Chris has been doing a lot of digging into the data sheets, which tell us that Baral's Expertise was putting up surprisingly good numbers before we cut it. Perhaps that's because it's about as close as Blue gets to a sweeper-like effect, and it was fulfilling a role that we didn't know we needed. It's back, taking the place of Agent of Treachery. When we first created this cube, Agent was one of those top-end creatures that the cube revolved around, and it dominated its fair share of games. It's fallen off significantly since then, enough so to the point that we're ready to remove it. Now here's where the listener's opinion would be great. Chris and I had a healthy debate as to whether or not we should replace Agent of Treachery with Kiora Best the Sea God. On one side of the argument, it's a great stabilizing tool against aggro decks and often slams the door against them. Blue could use another card like this. On the other hand, we've had bad play experiences with it before due to how hard it is to interact with the card, and it's difficult to deal with nature bleeds over into non-aggro matchups. What are your thoughts here? Would you bring in a somewhat problematic card to fill a role that you're eager to fill, or would you leave it out to prevent the feel-bad play patterns at the cost of not having something quite as good to fill that role? Let me know if you want to weigh in on this one. Black got a bunch of new toys and some quality of life changes, but we'll stay on theme and start off this section with Tainted Adversary, a solid 2-drop that brings a bunch of friends along for the ride if you dump some extra mana into it. Now this stands out as one of the lesser adversaries of the bunch, but it's still far above the line in terms of playability. At 2 mana it plays offense and defense fairly well, and at 5 mana it gives you 2 Decayed Zombies to play around with. Obviously, Decayed is a pretty big drawback to have attached to your creatures, but the Unrestricted Cube has plenty of ways to get extra value from a few zombie temps, and if all they do is a bit of extra damage to the opponent, well, that's good enough for some flavors of black aggro. It's not as flashy as some of the others, but it's another 5-drop or 8-drop that you can squeeze into the 2-drop section of your curve. Attempting to lower the overall curve a bit for black, we're parting ways with Witch of the Moors. This card looked pretty good in a recent iteration of the Arena Cube, and we figured there were enough incidental ways to trigger it that it would appeal to someone's sensibilities, but even so, it's a bit undersupported, and it seems our players aren't interested in drafting the card. Jadar's an interesting card as a fragile 1/1 that can spit out a steady stream of decayed zombies turn after turn, assuming you have ways to get rid of the ones you already have. That's not asking much considering you can always attack with them to have them essentially kill themselves. Besides sending them to their own death in combat, there's a plethora of sacrifice effects to take advantage of a free body turn after turn. Think Priest of Forgotten Ways or Yawgmoth. In a lot of ways, Jadar should play out like a better version of Dreadhorde Invasion, which was the cut for Jadar. Ideally, you want to use the Amass token from Dreadhorde Invasion to fuel some sort of sacrifice engine, since it's pretty unrealistic to get the army big enough to have a real effect on combat. If you're just using it as sacrifice fodder, Jadar serves the same purpose without the 1 life premium per turn. Additionally, Jadar gives you a 2/2 immediately on your end step, whereas Dreadhorde Invasion requires a full turn cycle to put anything on board, and asks that you wait another full turn before that token can even attack. Vengeful Strangler is an intriguing card that Chris is heavily advocating for. I see where he's coming from, and while I'm not as excited as he is, there are times that this card's going to look insane, namely when it trades for an opponent's blocker and then transforms to kill their best creature or planeswalker. I think you'll need to facilitate this yourself more often than not by sacrificing the body, since it can't block and your opponent's unlikely to block it, but sacrificing the body should be more than manageable. Alongside any recursive effects like Lurrus or Order of Midnight, it starts to look even better, so yeah, I'd say I'm eager to see this card in action. Blacklands Paragon is a fine Magic the Gathering card that plays offense and control fairly well, and it's the type of card that will probably see its way in and out of the cube a number of times. It's on the backward swing of that pendulum, and out it comes to make room for a different 2-drop. Okay, Lazotep Reaver might not be the first creature you think of when it comes to higher power level cubes, but this card's pretty good at doing what you want it to do, that is, make 2 bodies that can be sacrificed to your value engines. It's also a bit of a teaser for some of the zombie tribal elements we've been eyeballing for the cube, but we're going to put that on the back burner until we see what Crimson Vow has to offer. For now, Reaver is a Raise the Alarm style effect for black and a speed bump for aggro decks to get over. We cut Glint Sleeve Siphoner, which I would say has been an underperformer without being a complete bust. You'll include it in your black aggro decks, but it won't be the premium creature for your deck. Perhaps it takes a hit from being the sole source of energy in the deck. Without the backup to produce extra energy, this card takes a while to net you any actual cards, and a 2/1 Menace for 2 needs to do a bit more to earn its keep. Yo, our boy Spawn of Mayhem is back in the house. I don't know about anyone else, but this is the creature I fear the most from black aggro decks. It's also the card I misplay against the most, since nearly every time it comes down for its spectacle cost, I realize I probably could have prevented it. Spawn's an excellent aggro creature that scales into the late game quite well, and with black being about dead average in the cube, it feels like a good time to reintroduce the demon. We had Yahenni's spot to play around with since it felt like he's no longer necessary in the cube. Free sacrifice outlets are pivotal to the success of some Aristocrats decks, but between Woe Strider, the newly added Yawgmoth, and even Immersturm Predator in the gold section, I think we're set on free sacrifice outlets. This might be the most gratifying swap due to the name alone, but Massacre Worm is being replaced by Massacre Girl. The Worm came back very recently as a countermeasure against aggro, and it's occasionally successful at shutting down abortive creatures. However, we noted that Massacre Girl does a very similar thing, comes down a full turn earlier, is easier to cast, and has the potential to wipe an entire board of creatures, not just X2s. Yes, Massacre Worm has a higher ceiling since the life loss it provides can literally win the game, but pushing this type of effect from 6 mana to 5 mana suits our goals better. Alright, a couple non-creature spells to talk about here for black, starting with one of the gnarliest cards from the set, the Meathook Massacre. As a sweeper, it's a bit worse than Crux of Fate or Languish, and as a non-creature Blood Artist variant, it's competing with Bastion of Remembrance. But what if I told you you could get both of those effects on one card, add a much needed black sweeper to the cube, and have this badass artwork to look at on your enchantment while doing so? It's in whatever tier exists right below auto includes and gives the cube more redundancy in the sweeper category and the aristocrat section all at the same time. It's also a smooth enchantment for enchantment swap with Warlock class. Now, interestingly, I think there's a debate to be had about whether Warlock class or Ransack the Lab is a better card. Warlock class asks you to spend an extra mana to get the same effect, which matters or doesn't matter depending on the texture of the game. However, it provides a bunch of other bonuses that add up throughout the grindier game. That being said, Ransack the Lab is a sorcery, which I've already found to be crucial for a number of creatures and cards that specifically interact with instants and sorceries. Think Sedgemoor, Witch, or Kefnet. I believe the effect on Warlock class is better, but the typing on Ransack the Lab is more desirable, and while that doesn't mean it has to be one or the other, we're fine with a single version of this effect for now. What's going on with R&D lately where we just keep getting Doomblade variants in every other set? I'm not necessarily complaining, but man, we're to the point where we're practically cutting Doomblades for Doomblades, with Infernal Grasp being the newest addition to the lineup. This one trades out the usual conditional clause that we've come to associate with this type of removal and instead asks you to lose 2 life for your efforts. Seems like a small price to pay to unconditionally remove any creature from the board. Now, 2 life isn't negligible in an environment where small creatures are whooping up on people left and right, so with all things considered, it's actually a pretty fair card, and comes at a time where we're actively looking to increase the amount of cheap interaction in the cube. Sorry to anyone who used a rare wild card to craft Sign in Blood, but this one's just a bit of a junker here. It's not the black card draw we're looking for, it's pretty clear we want more effects like Ransack the Lab. The rare symbol on the card is especially egregious given that Sign in Blood has always been a common, and in our experiences, it plays out like a common. I imagine Disfigure should speak for itself and I don't have to explain why it's here to y'all. However, I'm sure there are a number of people who might wonder why we're not considering Davriel's Withering as a similar option. We desperately want our graveyard-centric decks to thrive, and until they get to the point where they feel like a real contender in the meta, we're going to hold back on too much graveyard hate. Davriel's Withering has secret graveyard hate text on it, since the perpetual debuff can prevent a number of small creatures from doing what they're here to do. Cards like Scrap Heap Scrounger, Reassembling Skeleton, Gutterbones, basically recursive small ball creatures. I don't think it'd be too harmful, but with Disfigure doing a perfectly fine job here, it feels like we can just avoid Davriel's Withering altogether. Speaking of small ball recursion, Call of the Death Dwellers, another card that reads very well, but in practice doesn't quite get there. Black is about 1 or 2 good 1-drops short of where we want it to be, and without a steady stream of 1-drops, Call of the Death Dweller misses out on its most powerful play patterns, that is, getting back a 1-drop and a 2-drop at the same time. We've got a pretty bittersweet addition to start off our red section. Bloodthirsty Adversary is a no-brainer addition to the cube, and if you've been following my love for this whole cycle, it should come as no surprise that I have nothing but positive things to say about it. The sad truth of the matter is that it clearly edges out Goblin Dark Dwellers, a card that we literally just got access to after begging for it for almost a full year. Dark Dwellers was an awesome addition from the recent Jumpstart release, but here's Bloodthirsty Adversary dethroning it not even a full month later. There's not really room for both of these cards in the 450 card list, and even though Goblin Dark Dwellers is occasionally the better 5-mana play, the tiebreaker goes to Adversary by virtue of it fitting into the 2-drop section of the cube instead. So we could sit here all day and talk about Falcon Wrath Pit Fighter, but it all boils down to this card being a 2-1 for a single red mana with no downside, and that's about all that needs to be said about it. Well, that and the ability is relevant in the late game once a 2-1 body is no longer relevant. Just like the 3-drops in white, the 1-drops in red have had a major overhaul in the last few releases, and we're finally at a point where we're happy with the quality of the cards in that section. Reckless Ringleader was a newer addition that we decided to cut here. It actually seemed interesting enough during gameplay, but it does fall somewhere closer to cute than necessary, and so it was a short-lived addition to the cube. Burn Down the House seems like an excellent modal sweeper for cube environments. A while back, we cut Hour of Devastation, noting that the damage it deals to planeswalkers makes it hard for an Izzet control deck to come out on top post-sweeper. While that's still true, Izzet has since morphed into more of a tempo deck than a control deck, and is significantly less planeswalker focused than it was when we made that decision. That means Hour of Devastation was always viable to re-enter the cube, but here we are with a better version anyway. The only upside Hour has over Burn Down the House is the ability to sweep indestructible creatures, but that's largely trinket text if we're being honest. What this new sweeper offers is an alternative mode of creating some devil tokens in situations where a sweeper isn't going to be good. It'll offer bodies in control decks looking to protect their own walkers, but it'll also put pressure on an opponent in matchups where the opponent doesn't care about having their board wrathed. It's a nice dichotomy of effects on one card. We cut Meteor Swarm, which we envisioned as a sweeper-adjacent effect that could help red decks clear the way of larger creatures. Turns out the card has looked unappealing during the draft, and the triple red is more of a problem than it seems. It would probably make sense to upgrade Shock into Play with Fire, but there's plenty of room for Shock variants in the cube. With our focus on increasing the density of cheap interaction, it makes sense to increase the number of Shocks rather than just sub them out for one another. Instead, we cut Krenko from the 3-drop list. I've gone on record saying that I'm not a fan of Krenko, nor do I think the card is bad. It's one of those creatures that, should it survive a turn cycle, can do some utterly broken things, but usually needs to have a clear attack to really go off. The ceiling is pretty high and the floor is pretty low, with the average case being somewhere in the middle. Red 3-drops are tough cuts since they're all pretty powerful cards, but the need for more removal and interaction demands a cut somewhere. This one's a little bit speculative, but having played with Reckless Stormchaser a bit in Limited, it seems like the power is there for Unrestricted environment. It's essentially a 3/3 haste for 3 that can sling around haste on other creatures at the beginning of combat. It also has a Nightbound side that gives an even bigger boost and spots Trample to the target as well, although it's a bit hard to parse out how Daybound and Nightbound will work out in a cube setting. Still, it's a beater that feels worthy of a test, even if it's a bit narrow in terms of which decks want this sort of effect. We're basically testing it because we've been dissatisfied with Burgi and the slot was open. Burgi has an appealing text box that looks a bit less impressive when compared to the other red 3-drops, and those cards almost always get top priority. Harnfell, the back half of Burgi, also reads like a late game card advantage tool, but this isn't retail limited. You can't really afford to tap out for a 5-mana artifact that needs you to untap to maybe start doing something. Note that we're also eyeing Anax Hardened in the Forge for this slot, and it may just take the place of Reckless Stormchaser should that card fail to earn its keep. Smoldering Egg is a cool new addition to the pool, and while I would have been ecstatic to pick up Thing in the Ice, I'm happy to pick up its little red cousin instead. It's mechanically different though, given that it checks the total amount of mana spent to cast the spells that trigger it rather than the number of total spells cast. That means there are some neat interactions with cards that have alternative casting costs. For example, flashback a Silent Departure for 5 mana, and that's 5 counters on the egg right there. It takes the right kind of deck to tick, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the back half of it is worth the investment. It should take over any game that it successfully transforms in, all while holding down the fort in the early game. We cut Rimrock Knight here as one of the more middling aggro creatures. Red is in no shortage of 2-drops, and Rimrock Knight has always been fine at best. This is less of a nerf to red aggro and more just trimming a subpar card. Cathartic Pyre is a little bit below average in terms of Lightning Strike variance, but enough better than a Braid that it seems like an easy swap for us. Artifact is not a problematic permanent type for our cube, and so we don't need to dedicate too many slots to be able to deal with them. Cathartic Pyre's secondary mode of card filtering isn't exactly good, but neither is a Braid's Shatter mode, and the Pyre can burn planeswalkers, whereas Braid cannot. This is just an easy swap until artifacts become a dangerous player in the cube. I actually misread Flame Channeler the first time I saw it, assuming you had to send a burn spell at the opponent's face to transform the card. I was pretty hype on that interpretation of the card, but it turns out that the Channeler flips no matter where you aim your burn spell at, so long as it actually deals damage to something. The back half starts to turn additional burn spells into extra cards, and feels like it could start a chain reaction of sorts, where your burn digs you towards more burn. All in all, it's a cohesive package that rewards you for being heavy on red burn spells, which many red decks do anyway, and the Channeler should often be a 2-mana 3/3 with upside in those decks. We cut Direfleet Daredevil to make room, even though Daredevil has been a decent role player. It's never a necessary addition to any given red deck, but the body is a fine 2-drop play with some real upside later in the game. Despite the ability to do some pretty strong things against the right kind of deck, Daredevil is an expendable creature, and here we are subbing it out for something new. Dreadhorde Arcanist is right on the cusp of playability for us. We keep getting closer and closer to this being a powerful engine piece for spell-based red decks, but for the time being, you pretty much have to pair it with another color to make good use of it. Its natural homes are blue-red, where it can flash back cheap cantrips like Opt or Brainstorm, or red-black, where you can pick up cheap removal or hand disruption like Fatal Push or Thoughtseize. Red has its fair share of shocks and bolts to flash back, but these tend to be high-value cards that get snapped up by other players, and so it's difficult to get the massive 1-mana spells needed to make the Arcanist reliably good. Still, we decided to bring it in and test the waters, since it's the type of card that only gets better over time. The cut might surprise you, since Kari Zev is one of Red's best creatures in the entire cube. In fact, Kari Zev holds one of the highest win percentages of any card in this 450 card cube, which is just a testament to how good red-based aggro decks are at the moment. It'll be back at some point, I'm sure of it, but for now, Kari and her Metal and Monkey Ragavan are going to take a backseat until aggro decks learn how to behave themselves. We don't need to discuss this one at length, since Thrill of Possibility isn't exactly the most exciting card to talk about. Just know that it fits in the cross-section of red-based spell decks and red discard decks, which are becoming a bit more fleshed out with inclusions like Drakehaven, Conspiracy Theorist, and a few Madness cards here and there. Sarkin the Masterless is back out, and honestly I think this card sucks so much that I'm not really interested in talking about it, so let's move on, shall we? We'll start off green with one of the more speculative cards from the bunch. Death Bonnet Sprout is a repeatable self-mill piece on a pretty forgettable body, but once you hit 3 creatures in the yard, it transforms into a pretty gnarly beater that only gets bigger over time. It's a bit narrow in what it's trying to do, namely it's a piece for green-black decks, and most other green decks won't be interested in it. Still, that deck could use a few more pieces, and so we'll see if the Sprout can find its way into some Golgari decks. Wall of Blossoms just came back in, and we're immediately removing it again. It's basically here for the same reason we're including Death Bonnet Sprout. Give you some tangible on-board presence and serve as a speed bump against faster decks. Wall of Blossoms is never going to be a standout card in any deck, but I'm sure it'll make an appearance here and there whenever we need a filler green card. Alright, on to some more exciting stuff. Augur of Autumn is our historic cube version of Courser of Kruphix, and honestly, it's probably better by a decent clip. Coven isn't something to build towards in-deck construction, but it'll come together naturally throughout the course of most games, after which Augur of Autumn becomes a card advantage machine, letting you skim through the top of your library one chunk at a time. The best part is that the ability to play lands isn't tied to the Coven clause, so you still get to use this as an Oracle of Moldiah twin during the early parts of the game. For this spot, we removed Ronus the Indomitable, a creature that I've never been too keen on, and one that looks even worse now that we've cut back on a lot of green aggro creatures. Ronus can put in work for sure, and being a cheap 5-power creature matters for a number of cards, even if it can't attack or block, but the times where this can't engage in combat really hurt it, and the activated ability only seems to be relevant on board states where you're already pretty far ahead. Briar Bridge Tracker is a great little value creature, even if, as I've said with a number of other cards, it'll never really be the best card in your deck. It's more of a play that helps pave the way from the early game to the late game, putting a decently static creature on board, and replacing itself at some point later in the game. It's worth noting that the stat boost isn't tied to the clue token, rather you'll get +2/+0 off of any token sitting on board. It reads like a Selesnya tokens card, but it should make the majority of green decks that are looking to pressure the opponent in some way. Sadly, we landed on Springbloom Druid as the cut. I know I gushed a little bit about it during the previous update, and it's certainly fine, but it's so obviously overshadowed by other 3-mana accelerants like Selvala and Rishkar that it just feels a bit outclassed. The landfall aspect of the card is nice, but not enough to earn a premium spot in the cube. The green adversary is a tricky one, and the one that, if I had to guess, will end up being the first one removed from the cube down the line. That's not to say that it isn't powerful, being able to animate some lands and go on the offensive in the late game, all while being a generously statted 4-3 trample for 3. Well, that's obviously good. What I mean is that the late game kicker ability can be a bit risky, and decks looking to ramp to an effect like this have plenty of other high quality threats to ramp into already. Primal Adversary gets points for flexibility, but it's not the best late game threat you can ask for, even if it's got the potential to run players over. Speaking of late game threats, we're pulling Pelakka Worm back out. I was actually impressed with how Pelakka Worm performed during its stint in the cube, but it was a pick tailor-made to combat aggro, and now that we're trimming back on aggro pretty hard, it feels like we can afford to drop the worm since it's pretty lousy in a lot of other matchups. It's nice when you get to make a change that's just aesthetically pleasing as a one-for-one swap, as is the case with Consuming Blob replacing Biogenic Ooze. A 5-mana ooze for a 5-mana ooze, it just feels right, you know? Now, the jury's out onto whether or not this swap's correct. Biogenic Ooze is a potent threat in the mid to late game and a deadly mana sink should it go unchecked. Consuming Blob is a bit less explosive, but has the potential to make larger tokens without any additional mana investment. These are the types of cards that prompt us to play things like Deathbonnet Sprout and Ransack the Lab, if anyone's wondering. At any rate, if the blob turns out to underperform our expectations, we can easily sub back in Biogenic Ooze. We had quite a lot to say about Tovar's Huntmaster during our Midnight Hunt review on the Deep Dive podcast. Having played with the Daybound-Nightbound mechanic since then, it's apparent to me that night doesn't come around too often in the average game. Forcing the game state to change to night by straight up not doing anything on your turn is a pretty bad way to go about things since the opponent has control over just switching it back to day. Still, this card produces 10 power and 10 toughness across 3 bodies with the potential to spit out more wolves and threaten to fight off the opponent's creatures. That's a lot even if it takes some work to get to the other side. I do like the fact that Daybound Nightbound cards play well in conjunction with one another, so the package of Tovar's Huntmaster, Arlen, and Reckless Stormchaser feels like a nice include for now. We landed on cutting Carnage Tyrant here for the simple reason that Carnage Tyrant absolutely hoses blue-based control decks, which are the decks that are struggling the most right now. The intentional hate is not needed for now, so if you see Carnage Tyrant rear its ugly head again, it means blue decks have probably been doing better. Finally, for green, we're adding another piece of self-mill in card selection with Tapping at the Window. It's notably weaker than a lot of other card selection tools. For example, compare this effect to Ransack the Lab, but the flashback clause means that you do eventually get card advantage off of it, plus it has the bonus of still working from the graveyard should you incidentally mill over this card. I don't expect it to be a powerhouse, more of a role player for Golgari decks looking to fill their graveyard. The cut was Harmonize, which is a dead average card, neither horrendously bad nor impressive by any means. Green has enough late game explosive card draw, for some reason, that you can ramp straight through the turns where you'd be casting Harmonize and cast something like the Great Henge or Rishkar's Expertise instead. Alright, given my stance throughout this entire video, it should come as no surprise that the Boros section will look a little bit different after this update. We'll start with Rip Apart coming in over one of the biggest defenders, Showdown of the Scalds. Showdown was a card we skipped over when Kaldheim released, then at the recommendation of one of our admin members, included it for a trial run, and my god, this card is absurd. It is, in my opinion, the quintessential Boros aggro card, allowing you to refuel once you've emptied out your hand and build your board at the same time. I often find this card to play out for just 4 mana, like a draw 4 that puts 3 to 5 +1 counters on your board. This is over the course of a couple turns, mind you, but the mana investment was only 4 mana when all is said and done. It's absurd, and as much as I love drafting it, Boros needs to slow down a little bit, which prompted our decision to remove it. Nothing special to note about Rip Apart, it's just filling the spot for now, since there aren't really many interesting Boros cards to talk about. Winota isn't as consistently broken as Showdown of the Scalds, but it feels so hopelessly, randomly broken that, again, we just don't need this card in the pool. Winota can single-handedly produce the most busted draws this cube is capable of, and is so anti-skill intensive that I've always found losing to this card, or even winning with it, to be a complete drag. The only thing it asks of the player is to draft a healthy mix of humans and non-humans, but even with a suboptimal distribution of creature types, Winota still produces Oops I Win board states as early as turn 4. It's not a fun card or a fun design in my experience, and I'd like to leave it out for good. You know what doesn't accidentally win the game when you play it? Swiftblade Vindicator. Fine card, fine set of abilities, wears equipment nicely. It's a tame Boros card that you'll still pick up while drafting, and that's kind of what we need right now. Rem Carolus Stalwart Slayer has a stupid name and is riding a stupid Griff Swanbird, but hey, the card has some potential, so I'm not going to knock it too hard. We're talking at worst a strictly better Sky Knight Legionnaire, and while that's a card that holds its own in limited set drafts, Unrestricted Cube is a different beast, and you need to be a fair bit better than that to run with the big boys. Thankfully, there's some extra text, which seems like it could be relevant. You basically get a +1 on damage dealt by your own spells, and a small bit of protection from your opponent's burn spells. The protection is less exciting given that Rem doesn't protect itself, and that you've hopefully snapped up the best burn for yourself, but the extra damage buffer is a nice bonus. At any rate, Venerable Warsinger was a creature we speculated on. Turns out it's the type of card with an appeal in text box that just doesn't pan out in practice, so it's something we're happy to remove. Orzhov gets to pick up a new tool with Flesh Taker, yet another 2 CMC card for the Aristocrats deck. There's so many of these at this point that it's almost comical, but Flesh Taker fits in as well as any other. It's threatening on offense or defense, and passively buffers your life total while filtering through the top of your library. These decks usually have tons of fodder to sacrifice, and Flesh Taker will help you find the pieces you're looking for, even if its ability isn't the thing you're sacrificing creatures to. It feels like a good replacement for Hidden Stockpile, a Peasant Cube all-star that feels underwhelming here. There are so many powerful abilities that you can dump your sacrifice fodder into that it makes Hidden Stockpile look weak in comparison. Sure, Stockpile can still spit out a token per turn, but you lose some of the appeal of being able to reuse the same servo over and over again for scry value if your other cards are giving you the same value with additional benefits on top. Join the Harvest is yet another Raise the Alarm type variant that comes with a hefty flashback cost that adds a few more humans to your party. It's strictly a green-white go-wide card and not wholly unique for a gold card. Still, it does pretty much exactly what green-white wants to do, and we're at a critical mass of these effects, so you're bound to see them in the draft if you're looking for one. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why, but Dramoka's Command has been seeing almost no play. Maybe Selesnya is just not popular, but Dramoka's Command is frequently seen last pick in the draft, even though it has a wide enough set of abilities that it should be useful in any green-white deck. The numbers tell us that it's just wildly unpopular, and that's a good reason to part ways with it for now. Funny, we cut Find Finality a while back because it felt unfair to aggro decks for the gold sections to have additional sweepers on top of the monocolored sweepers. Clearly, the tables have turned, and we're adding this one back for the exact reason that it punishes aggro decks. In theory, the front half has implications for decks looking to grind into the late game, but if memory serves correctly, literally no one ever casts the front half and just holds onto it until they can get the big blowout with Finality. It was one of our most winning cards before it got cut, and should give Golgari an extra tool to keep up with faster decks, even if it's easily poached and splashed in other decks. 6-mana Garruk is out for now, which admittedly never really needed to be in over 6-mana Vraska in the first place. Finality is basically a 6-drop, so it made sense to remove Garruk here, especially given that Garruk hasn't seemed that amazing. It's obviously powerful, but not significantly more powerful than other things you can be doing at 6 mana, and it's not synergistic with the rest of Golgari cards in any meaningful way. So given that Saheeli Sublime Artificer has had an extremely poor showing due to our data, we had a slot open up for Izzet. We weighed a couple of different options, but decided that we wanted to try out Riel the Everwise as another piece of the Drakehaven discard engine. It's easy to shrug it off as gimmicky, but I've played the deck enough to know that Drakehaven is a real win condition, and there's enough incidental looting and card filtering floating around that Riel actually seems like a good fit. Turning something as simple as Faithless Luden into 2 additional cards is powerful, and Riel can become huge in a spell-based deck. She's vulnerable and might not pan out, but it seemed worth a shot. Again, it's hard to say what went wrong with Saheeli. If I had to guess, her shortcomings lie in her being functionally the same as something like Young Pyromancer or Murmuring Mystic, but she can be attacked down pretty easily, a weakness that these other kinds of cards don't have. Arlen the Pack's Hope is a slam dunk for Gruul. Not that Gruul's hurting for playables or anything, but Arlen brings the beats no matter which side you're looking at. The front side protects herself exceptionally well, and the possibility threatening to flash in a giant creature in a Gruul deck scares me a bit, if I'm being honest. The backside hits like a truck or offers a huge mana bonus, similar to Chandra Torch of Defiance's mana making ability. Either way, you're happy with Arlen on board, and you can make good use of the abilities regardless of whether she's nightbound or daybound. We cut Rhythm of the Wild, which has always been a solid Gruul card in our lists, but has never been untouchable. Sometimes your big stompy Gruul creatures just need to come down with haste, but it's worth noting that we did include Reckless Stormchaser, which fills the same role as Rhythm and coincidentally plays exceptionally well alongside Arlen. To close things out, we've got an additional full cycle of dual lands coming in. We played with our admin Theo's version of a historic cube, which had a ton of mana fixin', and I guess that inspired us to bring in more. After all, one of my cube mottos is that you can never have too much fixing. The awkward thing is that we didn't have a full 10 card land cycle that we were happy to bring in, so we had to settle on 2 half cycles. I actually like the new slow lands from Midnight Hunt quite a bit since they're perfect mana fixin' from turn 3 onwards, but we're less enthused about the Snarls. They'll get the job done, but they're some of the lesser dual lands we could ask for. For now, that's what we're working with until we get a complete cycle of good cubable duels. So obviously 10 lands came in, which means we had to find 10 cuts. We trimmed some colorless cards, a couple of the multicolored gold cards, and a single card from each monocolored section. We'll lighten around the cards we dropped here. Just note that these aren't one-for-one cuts to match up with a dual land, just cards we needed to trim to make room for the land cycle. From white, we cut Loyal Warhound. It didn't do anything wrong, but it's competing with some of the better white 2-drops, and the Plains fetching ability doesn't actually pop off too often. Champion of Wits got the axe from blue. We knew we wanted to trim a 3-drop in blue, and we were between Illyrios and Champion of Wits. While the Champion might be a better card in a vacuum, Illyrios provides great counterplay to aggro, which is more necessary right now, not to mention that Illyrios is the better blink target for the blue-white flicker decks. Black is going to be losing Professor Onyx, which is a fine but expensive top-end card for black. We already talked about cutting the curve in black, so this cut should make sense, even if we could have just as easily subbed back in the Dreadhorde General. We took an axe to Embercleave from the red section, and good riddance really. Embercleave is an atrociously powerful finisher for red decks, and is very difficult to play around on the opposite side. Even if we weren't trying to nerf aggro decks, Embercleave might still get cut due to how often it just wins the game. I've been fiddling around with a list of cards that would make our historic Power 9, and just know that whenever we talk about that list on our podcast, Embercleave will be there. Ranger Class was a card we wanted to try out from Forgotten Realms, and while we've had mixed feedback on the card, it's a pretty easy cut for us. It's extremely mana intensive to get fully going, and the addition of Augur of Autumn gives us a much cleaner way to achieve the same effect. Zacama Chameleon is finally getting the cut here. It's been with us since the beginning, with an asterisk next to its name indicating that it's here for the Timmies in our cube, not because it's a necessary addition. I've had my fun with the card, but it's time for us to free up the slot, so this is goodbye, Zacama. Extus is similar to Zacama in that it's very niche in its role in the cube, and the deck that wants it doesn't come together very often. We've treated it like a Mardu card because of the back half, and as it turns out, the back half is the card you want more often. The casting cost on the front limits how often you can play it, and as we've seen from a couple cards now, Magecraft and white mana symbols don't really go together well. My only real memory of Blinkmoth Nexus being played is having an opponent mutate a Sawtusk Demolisher onto it, and then both of us spending the next 10 minutes trying to figure out why it was a 1-1 instead of a 6-6. If that's the kind of riveting cube experience you're looking for, then Blinkmoth Nexus might be the card for you, but we're not here for it anymore. Aethersphere Harvester is easily the best of the bunch being cut for the land cycle. It's a great stop sign against aggro, and even plays well in aggressive decks. The problem is that it's almost strictly sideboard material, and pretty much never makes the main. We're not keen on cards that really only come in for match 2 or 3, so we feel like we can afford to lose this one. And for our final cut, we have Karn, Scion of Urza, because this card sucks. Alright, according to my word processor, this video is over 10,000 words long. I don't know, maybe I have a problem. At any rate, I hope these insights are useful or interesting to someone out there, and if you made it to the end of the video, I'm hoping you've gotten something out of this. As always, I'm very interested in our audience's feedback, so come find our Discord in the description below if you want to chat about the changes we've made with this update. Also, if you like these sorts of videos and want to keep seeing them for future sets, please subscribe to the channel and come say hi. Alright, that feels like a good place to close things out. Thanks for watching as always. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I'll see y'all next time.